something. Okay, so ma'am, Mr. Aruna Roy, please take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali Asgar sir. I would only like to say that I'm speaking to mature people who probably know as much or more than I do. And I'm a little unnerved by the fact that I did not know about your group before I came on the screen today. I expected to see young people who needed to be told what dissent was. But I now find that I'm with Professor Hargopal and with you and with people, I assume, who know as much as I do. So why don't we just start with questions? Why don't you ask me questions and I'll answer, and let's have a conversation. Because lecturing is okay when you begin with students who are completely unacquainted with it, or young people who are unacquainted with it, or a new group that is unacquainted with it. So maybe I'll take about 5 to 10 minutes to introduce something, and then let's just discuss and talk. And let's have questions and answers, questions which can be part statements, but they can also be questions, because otherwise I think we'll probably waste the entire hour saying things that you probably know very well, and I needn't have uttered at all. And also we've lost some 10 to 15 minutes in for me trying to get on to the Zoom site. So if you agree, then we will go ahead that way. But if you think I should still speak, I will speak. I'll speak maybe then for 15 minutes and then open up for questions and answers, or discussion probably, rather than question and answer, because you're all very mature people. And I will probably learn a lot in the course of the evening.
Yes, sure, ma'am. I think that's a good idea. So we'll listen to you about for 10-15 minutes when you open up the topic, and then we can have I think a good conversation for about an hour or so after that.
Thank you. Let me begin by saying that you quoted Romila Thapar and about dissent being one of the core principles of democracy. I think it's one of the core principles of life. I really think that without dissent, you really cannot even have a family. I remember my father, who was a lawyer, training us to disagree with him. And when my mother said that you were going to land yourself in trouble, he said to her, well, if they don't know how to disagree and then to state their arguments, and then to prove what they're saying is right or wrong and accept the final result, they're not worthy of being in this country or in this world. My mother was a rationalist, so she believed in rationally arguing things out, but not so legalistically as my father did. Between the two of them, I was brought up to believe that in life, dissent was natural. I never felt that dissent was an unnatural thing. I felt that dissent was natural, and in that process, I have learned and unlearned many things. I have listened to furious arguments between the best of friends, in which it almost felt in the end as if they would never again talk to each other. But they made friends again, and they disagreed and agreed again. And so the cycle went on. What has happened to our cultural habits and the culture of India is most shocking. We still have a constitution which hasn't been formally changed. We have a constitution that still exists. We have a vote that still exists. We have everything still existing. In fact, in the emergency period in 1975, all fundamental rights were suspended. So we knew that we didn't have the rights. And so there was a feeling of angst, and there was a desire to protest against that deprivation. But today what is happening is even more frightening. But what is happening is that the structure is still intact. So if you can't really say to anyone that a constitution doesn't exist, because it does in one manner of speaking still exist. In matter of fact way, it does exist. But in real fact, the Sardars and the peasants, the Sikh peasants of Punjab shouldn't have been in protest on the Delhi borders today if there had been a proper way of looking at dissent, disagreement, and the right to dialogue in a country like ours. So if you look at contemporary India, there's so many examples. Last year, for instance, all the CAA protests asked for a dialogue. If there is no dialogue in democracy, it ceases to exist. It becomes fascist, it becomes centralized, becomes a complete dictatorship. But there was no room for dialogue. And the problem is that all the platforms that existed for this dialogue have disappeared. We have seen systematically removal of, and with threats, with incarceration, the way in which dissent has been dealt with. I am sitting with Professor Har Gopal, who has been witness to, part of, and the victim of many of these processes. So I need not argue my case any further, at least in front of him. He understands whatever I'm saying fully and well as a part of his own life. So today, let's at least think of another strategic way in which probably we can pose another set of arguments. But it doesn't take away from the fact that we are all struggling today to re-establish those basic cultural tenets, the political processes of democracy, the principles of democracy, and the culture of a democratic state in which you can state your point of view without fear, which doesn't exist today. Actually, people need to be politically educated. We have been doing, and we are doing, the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan has actually taken out a very small tractor yatra through the villages of Rajasthan. We are going to end up in the Shahjahanpur border, which is the Rajasthan-Haryana border, and stay there with the protesters for a week or so. What we find is that democracy has let down its people basically by not educating the people in processes of democracy, in processes of politics, in understanding political differences, even in understanding the constitution. Nothing is understood. You have a Dalit who will vote against the constitution. You have very strange circumstances where women will vote not against, but for patriarchy. The inversions that have happened are the most frightening, because when you lose rationality and you do completely contradictory things, it's very, very frightening. The vote, which has become such a preoccupation and an obsession with the Indian polity today, it owes its existence to the constitution. After all, without the constitution, there's no right to vote. And the right to vote by explicitly and implicitly gives us the right to differ. It gives us the right to dissent, and it gives us the right to disagree. It's actually an organic construct because it is interdependent on our right to dissent. Otherwise, what's the vote worth? I'm not merely choosing somebody. I'm entering into a social contract with an individual to say that I give you my vote, and for some period of time, which is 5 years or 3 years or whatever the duration may be, you will go into office and you'll perform as per my desires or as per my wants or deeds or as per the conditions in which I exist, because you go to represent me in parliament, you go to represent me in the state assembly, or you go to represent me in the panchayat. But this understanding of the vote has sadly been neglected. It has become a bargaining power of the most, what should I say, of the most mean variety, where a price has been attached to that vote, and that vote goes either for the highest bidder who gives you the most amount of liquor or the most amount of privileges, or it is completely dominated by what should have been extinct, according to Dr. Ambedkar, the caste system, where your identity, which used to be first identity, now religion has also come to play a part. So you use all these what obscurantist ideas that Radhakrishnan, Dr. S. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, so feared when the Constituent Assembly handed the Constitution to the people of India, that it might obscure our point of view and our rationality, just come to pass. I'm now 74. I was born a year before the Indian state was, the Indian nation was born. And I've grown up in a country in which cultural differences and the culture of dissent was really strong. I remember a time when Shankar's Weekly was a weekly which was produced by a man called Shankar, and Professor Har Gopal obviously remembers Shankar's Weekly, which used to have extraordinary cartoons of Nehru. And Nehru was prime minister at the time. But there was no case against Shankar. In fact, Nehru was supposed to have said to Shankar, make fun of me because I should know what I'm doing wrong. He says, don't spare me. The exact words were, don't spare me. Now, that understanding of politics, that understanding of a culture where dissent and critique was part of democracy has actually vanished. And it's a sad thing to say today that I if I talk in the public domain, and if the talk is reported in any social media or even in the net, then there will be 20,000 dislikes and all kinds of allegations against my character if I say anything that is not pleasing to the person who's reading it. There is no rationality in negation. There's no rationality in stating a counterpoint of view. But people like us who are on the fringes of poverty live exactly as people do. I'm not sitting in my place of work today. Unfortunately, I'm living in my domestic home because I have been asked to because of COVID and I'm over 70. But otherwise, in my place of work, we live in a mud hut. And in that mud hut, I'm close cheek to jowl with other mud huts and cheek to jowl with poverty. And for us all, there is a different saga of the expression of the right to dissent. For us, right to dissent has devolved into the right to even ask for a minimum wage of work. Today, as I talk to you, there is a union that we have formed of Manrega workers. And these Manrega workers have asked for nothing more than what government of Rajasthan has promised us, that you can ask for work. There is a campaign called Kaam Mango Abhiyan. And in that Kaam Mango Abhiyan, you can ask for work, which is an entitlement under a law passed in Parliament, which is MGNREGA, which authorizes you to claim 100 days work on minimum wages in your state. And when they go and demand work, the terrors of the terrors unleashed on the young people in the union, because the union's average age is about 25, is unimaginable. All kinds of allegations have come, including the fact that these girls, who are large majority of people who go to these work sites, are women in Rajasthan. So they're women and girls, and they've been told that, you know, this is a campaign which will destroy your virtue, that you're going to be taken there to be sold, because the interest of the corrupt has been hurt. So our right to dissent is at a very cutting and critical edge, because it's not about any theoretical issue. It's about life and livelihood, where it's about, will I get work tomorrow? Will my name be on that? I have a right to be on the muster roll, but will my right be honored? Will my minimum wage be paid? Will I be given those days work? Will my work be measured? Will I be given the right wage? These are all issues that are still critical for people living on the edge. And it's up to us to correlate to them, their plight in the Manrega site with the plight of the farmers sitting on the borders of Delhi. What is similar between these two very, very varied situations? Where are the similarities, and how do they understand? How do the people fighting for their work, young women fighting for their work and fighting for their rights in Rajasthan, some 4,000-5,000 of them, understand the importance of a battle being fought, a peaceful legal battle being fought on the edges, with civil disobedience as a mode being fought on the edges of Delhi. The Constitution has provided us some measure it has even provided for struggle. But the directive principles of state policy says that we shall strive to promote the welfare of the state. There was a huge battle, which about Hargopalji will know far more than I, about justiciability of the directive principles, and the progressive lot lost. And so the directive principles of state policy are only there as promotional or as visionary document, but not justiciable. But they have provided for, in the word, when they write strive, the state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting, as effectively as it may be, a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political shall inform all the institutions of national life. When they said it, they've given us the right to dissent and protest. National life is a huge scenario. It's a huge landscape. It takes care of much more than what you and I are involved in particularly. But in this huge landscape, you and I have the right to protest. So whether it's the wage worker in a Narega work site in Rajasthan, who's slowly becoming aware of democracy, the constitution, of national values, of rights, of democratic processes, of the interrelationships, or whether it's me theoretically fighting for the rights of the people, or people who fought for their right to be equal citizens under the CAA protest, or the farmers who say that those three obnoxious laws must be repealed, my sympathy with them. We are all on the same page, but that is to be understood. And I'm afraid the biggest tragedy with India today is that we are not understanding how this is happening. And I think the biggest onus of making dissent and disagreement appear as a natural process of scientific thinking, as a natural process of understanding, as a natural process of knowledge, as a natural process of life itself, devolves on people like us who are the social movement people, much more than on the others, because we have made it our life's cause. We have made it our life's cause that we will go into people's lives, we will work with them, we will try and work with their ideas, we'll try and, but it is not sufficient anymore. This has to be a national campaign of every citizen in the country working with people to make sure that they understand that dissent is necessary even for personal progress. For the person who wants to go and get a green card in the United States, it's as necessary to understand the role of dissent, because when that person goes into a scientific world or in a world of technology, without an assumption or a hypothesis which is based on facts, which accepts negation, you can't proceed. So how do you actually work with a concept of knowledge as a base? And that knowledge can never be gained without dissent, disagreement, or difference. How will it ever be? In this, the one thing that I think we've failed to work hard on as a nation is the social contract that we enter into with government on the basis of the vote. Unfortunately, this vote has got into such an obscurantist relationship between the individual and the state that we've forgotten that it's basically a social contract. And it's a social contract which can at all points of time not only be justiciable, but which can be legally understood and which should carry all the principles of the Constitution and the constitutional promises. But we don't understand how important the social contract is. And again, the people's movement has been fighting for understanding that this is a social contract. And if very briefly, if I can touch on the RTI movement, because I don't really want to talk only about that because I was a part of it, but both Manrega and RTI became possible because we talked about the social contract. And we talked about the obligation of an elected government to its people in terms of seeing themselves not as rulers, but as public servants. And the public servant has an obligation to be transparent and has an obligation to be accountable. These are two very important concepts that the right to information brought into public discourse, and which partially is understood even today, but the full implication of that understanding is yet to be realized as to how much it is that you need transparency and how much do you need accountability. Look at Parliament. I mean, I don't have to go into things you all understand. Look, institutions have all been derailed. Parliament is not meeting. It's now meeting after so much hangama, and we are saying that Parliament has not met. This Parliament should have met during COVID. It could have met virtually, but it should have met during COVID. It should have met many times after COVID. It did not meet. Therefore, we organized what was called the Janta Parliament. Today, we had the last session where we had political party leaders coming, and we posited the various special session of the Janta Parliament for the farmers' protest. But we've had a previous session of the Janta Parliament when we sat for 5 days and we had regular proceedings like Parliament. We passed resolutions and we demanded that the real Parliament, that is the elected Parliament, listen to our demands. By precept and example and by protest, what are we trying to tell them? That they tell them that they have an obligation to be accountable to all of us, to be part of a distinct dialogue in which the dialogue is contained within the Constitution, within promises made and promises not kept. And I think it's important that we understand it in this context. Otherwise, we go into a miasma. Of course, it's true, I haven't gone into very many things. The incarceration of extremely intelligent and very honorable, ethical human beings incarcerated. There's been so many of them, I don't have to go through the list now. And people shot dead for rationality. What is this? Is this a country of which I should be proud? I wonder sometimes what has happened to the age-old rationality that this South Asia actually had. that it carried with it from the times of the Buddha, because at that time there was no India, there was no Pakistan, no Bangladesh, no Nepal, no Sri Lanka. We were all one cultural mass. And at that time, this whole nation, this whole area produced minds that talked about rationality, talked about ethics, talked about materialistic philosophies, talked so much on issues that are so fundamentally important to this world even today. And what has derailed us from that? And I principally think it's lack of dialogue. I really think it's lack of dialogue. It's lack of focused dialogue. It's the lack of determined dialogue. It's the lack of principled dialogue. So when you say democracy dialogues, I'm extremely happy that you've started this series of dialogues, but you need to go out into the people, to go out into the students, the villages, and the periphery of our lives to really talk about this further. I'll end here now, and we will take this discussion further. I may have talked for more than 15 minutes. I beg your pardon for that, but we'll proceed onwards from here.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a very good opening for this conversation. And we especially what you talk about, how the right to vote is a right to dissent. And that can bring about a lot of change. I have a question from Mr. Srinivas, but then before that, I would like to invite Professor Hargopal to comment on this whole right to dissent issue and to add to what Ms. Aruna Roy has just said.
Of course, it's always a pleasure and extremely rewarding to listen to Arunaji because she is in the field. Her entire knowledge comes not only from her scholarship, but it comes from the experience working with the people's movement. That's why she commands so much of respect, because unlike some of us who have been partly in the academic, partly in the field, but she dedicated herself completely to the cause, and particularly the cause she has taken up advanced quite a bit. We didn't realize the potential of right to information when we were debating initially, but the way it started unfolding itself, we saw huge potential. She located one right, at least, which had a democratic potential. But when you look at Indian society, I would like to, Aruna, to reflect. How do we understand the character of middle class? Because if you look at European history, middle classes played an extremely important role in actually activating the civil society, in the literature, or in the different walks of life. But when you look at the Indian middle class, so last 6 years experience is so upsetting that we thought that the institutions in India are strong enough to, and there is a constitutional framework, and there is a middle class. But today, Aruna, if you look at the universities, I want to share an experience. Since I worked in the University of Hyderabad, I held all the positions, including in charge vice chancellor. But when students of University of Hyderabad wanted to organize a meeting, a lecture in the evening, the vice chancellor not only cancelled the meeting, asked all the shops on the campus to be closed, and called the police who are in the main gate, and informed the security that I should not be allowed to enter the university. So when I went to a small gate, since the security keeps on changing, they didn't recognize me. But my son was driving since my son also works, he said, I have some work, and why you have closed the gate? And then he said, one Professor Hargopal is coming, and university has completely asked us not to allow him inside. but there was no police. Police was at the main gate. So, I mean, since he didn't recognize me, he allowed my son to get in. And there was huge number of students waiting. And I said, we'll speak, or come what may. But since I knew the internal security people and the local commissioner police also was known to me. And then the registrar comes. Then he says, sir, there is no permission. I said, why do you need a permission? So for holding a meeting, students have a right. And I have worked in this institution. He said, no, no, sir, this Rohit Vemula venue is banned and university is not allowing any meetings. So, sir, I request that you come tomorrow. We'll have a regular meeting in the hall and we will give the permission to the hall. Now, students, of course, as usual, they said, no, no, nothing doing. But then I suggested that if the registrar is saying that tomorrow we'll have a formal meeting and in a big hall, okay, we'll one day, doesn't matter. Otherwise, it's a confrontation. So I said, we'll have meeting the next. The student said, no, we don't trust the administration at all. And the registrar promises, he says, sir, is my promise and all that. The students followed the registrar in a big procession. Unless you give the order now for permission, will not go. So they got an order. So next day but then the suggestion was not to say anything on Kashmir. See, I just don't understand how come a university like University of Hyderabad, which is known, I mean, one of the prestigious institutions, now has this culture. And look at JNU, the way it has been destroyed. One vice chancellor has so successfully destroyed the university that now recruitment, absolutely, they do not follow any procedure. And he appointed 80 faculty members against all the established procedure and all from their own ideological orientation. And completely the admission of the students has been taken away from the faculty. And the faculty has not been able to fight. That is the JNU faculty, which is known for dissent, in fact. So I think one has to reflect how to not only communicate to the people, because in contrast with the university system, the way they have become vulnerable, look at the farmers, look at the peasants, their common sense, their understanding of political economy, their understanding of institutions, their understanding of constitution. One is amazed. Now, somewhere the democratic potential seems to be lying with the ordinary people of India. It's they who also got us out of emergency. So somewhere I think we have to perhaps trust, and how this particular present farmer struggle will end. I think we're all with lot of anxiety watching. Now Supreme Court intervened, and I mean, I do not know they should have intervened, but they intervened. Now they want to appoint a committee, and the committee members are anti, farmer. 3 members at least are known for their views. They have written in favor of the farming laws, and now Supreme Court does that. And Supreme Court also has become so vulnerable. One is not able to believe that institutions, all institutions, I mean, I'm saying institutions have become so vulnerable. Right to information, Aruna, you have seen that how they have weakened the institution after institution. After the second term, in the very first parliament, the SC/ST Commission, National Human Rights Commission, Right to Information Commission, and the present rulers do not understand one thing, that all institutions are important in governing and they can't govern. Their governance becomes absolutely difficult. Today, if Supreme Court had the legitimacy, which normally it enjoyed, then farmers would have looked to judiciary. But now they're saying, no, 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 we'll not, they may not even accept the tomorrow judicial pronouncement. So I think this is one sector which we have to reflect. Is it that if you look to Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire said that developing societies, when they pass through a transition from culture of silence to semi-intransitive condition, the manipulation or the manipulating political elite successfully spread misinformation And it takes time for the people to understand. And once they understand, then critical consciousness, democracy flowers. I mean, is it that we are passing through that semi-transitive condition where the people are conscious but not fully conscious? Another thing I wanted to reflect, the day before yesterday, Justice Venkatachalaya spoke on the judiciary. Now, two observations he made are, one is he said there is a democratic fatigue, that people are not willing to take the responsibility in different walks of life. And therefore, you look for a strong leader. So, any society which looks to a strong leader or looks for a strong leader, he says there is something of a fatigue. I don't know, he used this term democratic fatigue. And then he said, we are a weak society. We are not able to resolve the question. And therefore, when the society is not able to resolve the conflict within with its creative capacity, then he said the strong leaders emerge from that type of historical situation. But I totally agree with you that without dissent, Romila has very beautifully brought out that dissent has had a long tradition in India. It's not that even argumentative Indian, that was Amartya Sen's argument, that we have always people who argued. But now I do not know what happened to our cultural resources. And I think all of us have underestimated the role of culture. We thought that institutions, constitution, I mean, they will play the role, but the present ruler chose the cultural route, and people were vulnerable. That vulnerability was very high. We didn't properly perhaps comprehend. But now you look, the minute they appeal to the cultural symbols, people are responding. I mean, they are not. I mean, although there is so much of cultural plurality, it's a diverse society, but still, the way the people are responding, I mean, it's quite unbelievable. I mean, and my last point is that we have Telangana. We fought for it for a 1953 onward. This Telangana concept has always been there. All of us became a part of the movement. But a government and a chief minister who has come from a people's movement, from people's 1994, 1996 onwards, Telangana, and massive participation was there in the Telangana movement. But the movement, the social movement that we talk, it produced an authoritarian leader. It's very surprising. Although, I mean, when Telangana movement was going on, I wrote an article in the EPW, the Telangana People's Movement, Unfolding Political Culture, where I said there is a manipulative culture, there is a democratic culture. Whether Telangana will really move towards the democratic culture, or these manipulative people will take over, and what we feared, it happened. He is an authoritarian, he is completely, solo. I mean, everything has to go to him. He won't allow any minister to speak. This is happening in different states, but this is happening after a long people's movement, where I always thought that if the political system gets into crisis, there will be people's movements to deepen the democracy and to protect the democracy. For farmers' movement is one fresh, so refreshing that all of us are hoping that it would deepen and it will become a people's movement and democracy will be protected. But otherwise, a strong people's movement in Telangana should produce an autocratic leader. Is where do we go wrong in producing, I mean, in building the people's movement, I think is also one of the questions, because we are passing through that crisis in Telangana. Now, therefore, I mean, I'm just sharing it, random ideas. But since Aruna asked no, so I thought I'll share some of my concerns. But then I would like also, Aruna, to how do you foresee the situation? I mean, since you are with the people's movement directly, now do we foresee that something like what happened, people rejecting massively the emergency, whether the present regime will face that type of setback, or will these people continue for some more time and destroy all constitutional values and silence the dissent? I think these are some of the concerns we are passing. We are passing through very sad and very bad times. On 1st January, actually, I tried to contact you just to share the concern, hoping that this year will be better than last year, both in terms of the health situation and also in terms of the democratic, situation. Because I spoke to Harsh Mandar, I spoke to some people. I also want to say, but I couldn't, get your, connection. So, but these are some of the concerns I am, right now passing through. It's a sharing concerns, perhaps not, analysis or anything, but these are reflections. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. That was a very important 3 points that have come up, and I would like ma'am to comment on them as how curbing dissent is being used as a mean to destroy universities, destroy institutions, and how we have all got into a democratic fatigue so that the government is able to do whatever it wants to do. And most importantly, that how the people's movement, that the Telangana movement, as I remember Telangana movement from my school days, when we used to also go out on the streets and participate in the rallies. How that has resulted in a totally manipulative polity to emerge from in Telangana. So, would you like to make a quick comments on these?
Well, I'm going to quickly, not so quickly, but try and be as fast as I can, because Professor Hargopal has raised a range of issues. And I would like to, because they're all issues on which a conversation is interesting and vital. So I'm going to touch upon a few things instead. The difference between the industrial middle class that came to be in the West and us is vastly different. I think the middle class, they grew into its position of power over a historic period of time. Industrialization happened over a period of time. In the newer democracies and post-colonial history, things have happened at a phenomenal pace. So change has come technologically, change has come monetarily without the same amount of time, that without giving ample time for changing ideas, positions, prejudices, caste affiliations, etc. So what we have done is that we have a sudden leap into affluence without the understanding of how to use that affluence, that position or that authority for normative values. We've dumped normative values. Actually, what we are struggling for today is establishing those normative values back into society. So if the middle class will therefore never be responsive to your push and pull. And I think the biggest challenge again is the middle class. How are you going to deal with them? But there's a burgeoning middle class. And this is what I think my attention is towards now. And the burgeoning middle class is the rural middle class. The first girl in the family, a mother illiterate, grandmother illiterate, who's just become a graduate or just become a school leaver. How do you talk to that individual to make them understand the normative values that come with this extremely, absolutely euphoric, this feeling of power that they get when they're first able to get out of the house. And today in rural Rajasthan, girls are wearing dresses that girls wear in Delhi. I mean, it's no longer a difference in dress and attire where modesty or one of those old-fashioned things in Rajasthan prevailed. So you see them as modern replicas of Delhi, the girls, and all this because of social media and because of exchange of photographs and things that are happening. But those children are eager for empowerment. They're eager to get into a frame in which they are valued as human beings. But what are we doing for them? My entire thing is that the educational system, the system of schooling, I would call it, divorced itself from education. I think Gandhi's new Nayi Talim had a great deal of sense in it because it brought in some kind of normative value into education. And though I'm so much for the right to education. I'm so much for government schools, but government schools are not places where you get normative education at all. So you are divorced. For all of us, what we are forgetting and why there are so many people incarcerated from Maravara Rao onwards, I mean, you're part of Andhra's culture, so many other people, what did Tel Tumbre do? The power of thought is still frightening to many people. What else have they been? They're not armed people. They have had nothing in their hands. One is a poet, one is a Dalit activist and theoretician. Why are they in jail? They're in jail because their ideas are powerful. Their ideas are persuasive. So today, what we see and what this dissent, the curbing of dissent that we see on the larger scale, I won't go into names, but you know so many of them. And even Professor Hargopal, why is Professor Hargopal such a threat to the state? Or why, how can he be? He's not armed, he's not propagating violence, but it's the power of thought. And for once, the power of thought is divorced from the power of the rulers. So the power of thought now has a different spatial connotation. And because of having a different spatial connotation from the power structure and looking at power in a completely different manner, there is confrontation. And I think if we read Bertrand Russell, who has written a book on power, and I went to Noam Chomsky's office in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and found a huge portrait of Bertrand Russell in his room. And we've forgotten, we are not reading Russell anymore on power. We don't want to understand power. We have to understand power to understand why dissent and disagreement are being subjugated. We need to understand the many layers of power. In this normative vacuum that we have today, public normative vacuum, not mine and yours, but in this public normative vacuum, fear is a big player. And fear, because of so many things, and I don't need to go into details with you, you know what it happens when you are afraid. You lose all reason, you lose all rationality, you are afraid of your own shadow, and to be violent and to be dismissive of any kind of dissent or disagreement becomes that much easier and feeds one into the other. The potential is again with people, of course it's true, but are we working with them? Because the social media, what Ravish Kumar calls the WhatsApp Academy, is filling their heads with extraordinarily conky ideas. What are we doing to set those conky ideas right? And believe me, it's quite easy if we persist. But are we persisting? Are we really working with them? Are we really having evening classes on what Gramsci said? Or are we having evening classes on what Ambedkar said? Or are we having evening classes on what Gandhi said? Or Bhagat Singh said? Or anyone said? None at all. So their heads are filled with anything. One very important thing for middle class, for all of us, which we have not played up enough, and for which Professor Hargopal stands witness that the MKSS was lambasted in the beginning. They told us that because we were interested in governance, we were co-opted. I remember many people saying to us that if the RTI movement is going to confront governance, it's all right. But if it has any importance of governance, governance is not merely the passage of a law. Governance is the way the law is used and implemented. The governance is the way it's translated, how the constitutional principle is translated from a principle into a program, into its procedures, and finally how the ration reaches that poor person in that home, in that hut. But we are not willing to concern ourselves with that. Governance is critical. It's not only governance in educational institutions, it's not only governance in revenue institutions, it's governance everywhere. And we're not showing up the lack of governance of this present system. We have taken a few schemes and shown them up. Perhaps peripherally, people like us from the movements, especially Swachh Bharat, we have been exposing things like Swachh Bharat, but there are many other such scams. And today they're using prevention of documents, of access to documents, because they're scared. Statistical data, they don't allow us to access statistical data. Because if you access statistical data, with our superior intelligence, because there is intelligence outside the governments as well. We will analyze the data and show them up for what they are. The fatigue that you talk about, the fatigue is the fatigue of ignorance as well, Professor Hargopal. It's the fatigue of trying to battle with an idea which you cannot comprehend. And I've seen it in my middle-aged women when I was also middle-aged, and how they struggled against those literacy classes. They used to say, you give us a pickaxe, we'll go and dig, but please don't hand us a pencil or a piece of chalk, because it's extremely an insult to a mature human being to have to grapple with saying, I'm ignorant, I do not know. And in our culture, we have not been promoting people to say, frankly, that they do not know, and we have not been teaching people how to learn. So that is how the manipulation that Paulo Freire says is so easily possible, because you've seen the possibility of affluence. You've seen the possibility of growing into a position where you can use that money, but you do not know the value of that money, or the value of even today, though you earn the money, where are you investing it? You're investing it either in corrupt practices, or you're investing it in gold. You're not investing it in infrastructure, building the country and making it a better place. You're not even investing it in so-called education of your children. But at least that now has somehow become, education has been linked to jobs and to a better life. So that's happening. So this fatigue is very true. And the fatigue of not wanting power is also the fatigue of fighting daily, which is necessary, and hardly, it's very, very difficult to fight. A struggle, that's why it's called a struggle, because you're fighting every day. It's not a struggle that you fight once and you sit back on. It's a struggle every day for accessing and using that power properly. So therefore, there is this, what absolutely shows itself as fatigue, but it is also a complete disempowerment of the individual. And I think, how do we see it? Movements leaders turn absolutely. I had a quotation which actually I wanted to read to you from Gramsci about how people turn into monsters. The movements give you heady power. You can also misuse power in the movements. Movements also give you power. Movement leaders are powerful people. They are not weak people at all. So when you are a movement leader, why and for what is the movement working? And how committed are you to the notion of participation and equality? Can be a movement leader completely committed to your own image. I will not name names, but I know of movement leaders who project their photographs so huge, just like Jayalalitha did, with no compunction about the size of their faces or of the people they are with. And Ambedkar and Gandhi disappear into the background. Just they are there in tokenism, but they appear huger than Ambedkar and Gandhi on posters. These are movement people whom we extol and we celebrate. So participation requires a critical analysis of yourself as a leader, of how do you perform as a leader, how equal are you as a leader, and how accountable are you as a leader. Are you accountable to your peers, not to your superiors? Are you accountable to your peers? Are you accountable to people whom you lead? And unless we have those values in, and I'm not going to go into details, you know what happened to the Aam Aadmi Party before, what happened to IAC before. Leadership becomes gung-ho with its own power. And then when you become gung-ho with your own power, then you've lost sight of all ethics, all the normative values that should permeate a public space. And then you become what it is. So the divorce between movements and the elected representative becomes further entrenched. And then movements have got damned in the process. They've had a lot of trouble reviving the space for the movement after the IAC. After IAC and its trajectory into electoral power, I think all movements have had to struggle to regain the extraordinary position that they enjoyed before the IAC. Before the IAC, there was public space available, the protests were available, and protests had a normative space in the ethics of governance. Today, movements do not have any ethics, any normative space. The moment we appear on the scene, we are either an urban Nakshal, or we are a terrorist, or we are anti-national. And by bringing in those words and the terror of those words to the people who might be supporting us, in the middle class, then you damn us, and then you finally incarcerate us. That's the process that's been followed. And to some extent, we can trace the roots of it back to what happened in the IAC at that time, India Against Corruption. So I think in a sense, we have to be self-critical. We also have to understand what we do wrong, what we don't understand. And since this is a group, I see there are only 24 of us in this group. If amongst us, it should be available, space should be available for a genuine reevaluation of where we stand. I think I have responded to Professor Hargopal, not briefly, I'm afraid. I have taken my time, but I thought it was too, I find this too exciting a space with him there, not to respond to him and to take the conversation further. But now, whatever you all say.
Thank you, Aruna. That was very powerful response.
Yes, I think that was a very good conversation we had between two stalwarts of the civil society in India. There is a question posted by Mr. Srinivas Yeramsetti on the chat. I'll just quickly read it out. A lot of the answers have already come in, but I'll still read out the question. The Indian Supreme Court in the Try judgment of 2016 has suo motu advocated for the enactment of Administrative Procedure Act. And APA exists today not just in Canada, Australia, South Korea, and other parliamentary democracies, but even in China. Why have social movements in India unable to raise public awareness on the need for an Administrative Procedure Act? Is the first question. Then he goes on to ask, is the populist tendency of Indian civil society limiting its ability to advocate for anything but substantive social welfare rights, what is called dole? Doesn't that give the central government a free hand to use administrative procedures to take away by stealth what it notionally gives through formally enacted laws like RTI, NREGA, and NFSA? How can this be addressed? So
I think this question will need another 1 hour to answer. It's really a huge question. But I would only say that different kinds of campaigns exist. I mean, I'm talking from a point of view of a poor people's movement, and a movement where the basic concern is the economic distress of people, where they have not been able to gain, according to Ambedkar, economic equality. And thereby social equality is also a question. But there are many people who are fighting for reforms, for police reforms. There are many people fighting for reforms within the system. There are people struggling to establish environmental rights. There are people struggling in every way. In which way? Every way. But there is no dearth of rules in the administration. It's the way it's implemented that's a problem. Sure enough, we may need public, what do you call it, Public Affairs and Administration Act, or what do you call it? The Administrative Procedure Act. We have so many acts in the government. There's so many rules in the government. One more set of rules and acts maybe will be a good thing. I don't deny that, because I think the legalistic frame is important. But the most important thing is the oversight in our country. And we have now tools of oversight. We have the social audit, which is a tool of oversight, which the Right to Information law gave to all of us. What is a social audit or a public audit, where people can access information, place it in front of people, and demand accountability from government? What we really need in terms of our own dignity today is oversight from the people, rather than another Administrative Procedure Act which looks at itself. I think within the system, there is no hope. I think hope lies from oversight from outside the system into its innards. I will only say that for the moment. But on your other issues, why have the social movements? Social movements don't take upon themselves the obligation to raise all kinds of issues. I mean, why don't you raise it? I would like to say, I would like to ask Mr. Srinivasan, since you have a PhD in public administration from the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University in Newark, why don't you raise it? I mean, people must raise whatever they're good at. Instead of telling others, why don't you raise that? I think you should raise it, because it's your concern, your preoccupation. You know more about it than I do. So you should raise it. Maybe I'll join you. But I can't be expected to carry out an idea which is germinated and seeded and matured in your head, which is not even known to me. It'll be something you'll have to do. You'll have to come and work hard at it. Like if I felt that right to information was an important thing, I had to work very hard to feel my way through processes to understand where it pained the most, where information was lacking. So you'll have to come and see it through. And so far as doles are concerned, what do you call a dole? I don't know, because NREG is not a dole. We work very hard for getting that minimum wage. You have to work 8 hours in the sun in Rajasthan to dig earth, you have to build something, you have to construct something, otherwise you don't get the wage. And right to information, for instance, is not related to money, it's related to constitutional values and ethics. It's public ethics. It's all the way public ethics. You can, under RTI, demand any kind of information. You can, we've asked for political parties to show their accounts. From there, you can ask for, we have tried to question this Prime Minister on the Prime Minister Cares, but before we could even question, he said it was not open to investigation even by the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. If money received in my name is not open and transparent for me to see, not for the person I have appointed through the CAG to see, then what is it worth? So for me, I think right to information doesn't become notional. Right to information, by the way, is used every year by between 60 to 80 lakh people who apply for information in India. In Manrega, 29 crore households go to get work. If it hadn't been for Manrega, after this extraordinary migration that happened after COVID, rural India would have died of starvation. It is only Manrega which has saved people from dying of starvation, and figures have doubled and in fact trebled in some states, in some districts, because of opportunities for at least covering your back when there's been such economic distress. There is really no dole. I don't really understand how you link social welfare to dole. Social welfare is not dole. The state takes upon itself the obligation to run those various agencies for the people, not giving it to privatization and market. That's all. We run a health hospital. We pay for it in our own way. We go there, and no government hospital is totally free. Medicines we have to pay for. Only the doctor's fees are not payable. But can you expect a person who earns 200 rupees a day, at the best, if he or she is lucky, to go and pay your doctor's fees today? India would be littered with corpses if we had to do it. So I think these are certain obligations. You look at Great Britain. Britain has national health, which is a free health service for which the richer people pay a tax. We don't look at the taxation policy. And I think there I'd agree with you. Why don't you collect taxation? I taught in the McGill University for one term. I was invited to teach. And when I taught there, they took two kinds of tax from whatever they gave me. One was the central tax and one was the state tax. And the biggest chunk of tax I paid was for welfare. And I didn't mind. Because that goes into looking after people who cannot earn the money they paid me, for their health care, for their other benefits, for education. And I think you really have to inverse the whole perspective and to see it that way. Otherwise, we won't address the real issue. And even Stiglitz, who's not a left economist, came to India and said that one of the best ways of addressing the poverty situation in India was the way for the whole world, which is Manrega. He said you create not only economic assets, but you create citizenship along with those assets, because you're making a person who has had no right, giving them the right to question as well. The right to question why there is a plan, what is a plan, why are you doing it like this, where is my wage? So you're giving them fundamental rights to question. And I will end whatever I am saying with this, that questioning is the most fundamental thing next to dissent, because dissent is questioning. But in an insidious way, the right to information law is training us all every year to question. And I hope that by questioning what is a very personal issue of something happening or not happening, we get into the habit of questioning when there is lack of performance in a much larger sense in society, and that we don't forget how to question.
Yeah, I think, yes, Mr. Srinivas, I think this is, adequately answered your question, but what I would like to add is that one needs to also keep in mind that uh, the Indian civil society is always working uh, against heavy odds, and especially those odds which come from the Indian politicians of all hues and colors. The we are as a social activist in Hyderabad for the last 30 years, what I've experienced is that whatever we do actually threatens the local politicians. The local politicians always take a agnostic stand against the civil society, because what we are trying to do is actually bring up people's issues. And what the politicians are interested is not the people's issue, but just the emotive issues which could fetch them vote. So that is the odds against which the Indian civil society is always working against. And I have umpteen of examples to give you about that from my own experiences. But I think we are crossed the time limit. And Mrs. Zia, do we have time to take this conversation a little more forward, or do we need to close it now? Mr. Masood, Zia, can you just enlighten me about the time?
We can wind up by 6:30, 6:22 now. So
okay,
that will be good.
Yeah. So well, fairly good. So I was telling you that why it's not right to always blame the Indian civil society about this, because the civil society is always fighting a battle against the vested interest among the political class. And I'm sure everyone here agrees with that. But if there is any more questions, we'll take that, and then probably.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Ranu Jain. I'm from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Dr. Roy, I mean, you are an activist and we are academician, and we do not have the kind of faith and confidence you have. Though, now on reflection after listening to you, I feel that history says that movements have been successful, but in India, somehow or other, civil society is so fragmented on ethnic and class terms. Like the kind of response that Kisan protest got did not get, was not there for NTCAA. And the kind of state action for Kisan is little hesitant, and it was much more pronounced in the case of NTCAA. We have fragmented middle class, we have very weak institution, we have tremendous fear, and international pressure also doesn't seem so conducive. I do not know what will happen now that leadership in America has changed. I mean, how can we build this kind of resistance, this kind of movement? It seems little dreamlike to me.
Well, I would say that, you see, there are two things my mother once said to me, and I tell you that she said, the day you stop hoping, your enemy has won. But that's what they want you to do. They want you to feel so helpless and so without hope that you will never do anything.
Yes.
Firstly, I think I would like to say that I would like to share it with all of you. It is something we just cannot lose hope. If you've lost hope, they won their final war, not the battle. They won all the little battles that you've stated, and they won the war the day you and I stop hoping. So that is something we just cannot afford to do. But having said that, let me say that Gandhiji, when things looked so terrible before independence, said, when you cannot win the big war, he said, you must fight the smaller battles, because you will forget the habit of battling. And once you forget the habit of battling, you've forgotten everything. So you have to continue to battle. And I think what all these fragmented segments that you mentioned are all battling. So far, so good, because at least we know that we will continue to question, that we'll continue to disagree, that we continue to dissent, not in the massive scale that has brought in the wrath of the state, but in smaller ways, we will disagree, and we will disagree with each other, and we'll dissent with the state. But I also think that one other thing that is critically important is that if you and I do not understand that everything fails or passes because of my own predicament and your own predicament, I continually look into myself to see what I have done wrong. That internal questioning in the middle class is completely, I think it's not there at all. They've done nothing wrong. Everything they've done is right. How in that kind of situation can you act?
Can't hear you. Suddenly can't hear you.
Am I audible?
Now, yes. Huh?
Okay. So it's in that context that it's very, very important. And I would also like to say that in the context of hope, I'd like to quote a Bertolt Brecht couplet to you. It's 2 lines of Bertolt Brecht, in which someone asked him, when you have lost everything, will there still be song? And he said, yes, there'll be a song about the loss. So you can't forget how to sing. In other words, he said exactly what Gandhiji said, but in a far more poetic way. I haven't quoted it correct, but it's the approximation to what he said. Will there be song when there is something? And he said, yes, there will be song about whatever. So we can't forget how to sing. And since you're in Tata Institute, where I've been so many times, it's been such a relationship with Tata Institute. You have to teach your children how to sing through everything.
I would like to have more live conversation with you. You really give confidence. Next time you come to TISS, right now is COVID period, I would love to meet you. In fact, I was in AC when you were there, but somehow or other I lost the opportunity of having one-to-one conversation with you. But now I'm feeling little encouraged because I participated in NTCAA movement to a very large extent, and I do try to protest against injustice which is taking place around me. But somehow or other,
look, the NTCAA movement gave me so much hope. Women led it.
Yes.
Yes.
Women were participatory in it.
Yes.
It was a non-leader movement, and so has the peasant movement. There is no one single individual who will turn tomorrow and become a despot, neither in the peasant movement nor in the CAA movement. And let's also not forget that despite everything, Bilkis from Shaheen Bagh was named as one of the 100 most powerful persons in the world by Time magazine.
Yes.
Let's look at that. And I honestly feel that I have never been so energized in my principles and my values as I have been by the CAA movement, especially the marvelous women I met in Bangalore, I met in Delhi, I met in Jaipur, who continue day after day. But for them, as well as for us, all of us, it's important to learn to understand the politics of democracy. And I think there have to be classes, adult classes, not literacy classes, but adult democratic classes where people learn about how to use democratic forces, how to use the vote, how to use power that is vested in us as sovereigns of the country, to elect somebody who will then be a servant for us. That is, we won't allow electoral bonds to come in. Because if you allow electoral bonds to come in, then your elected representative is not going to listen to you. He's going to listen to that, or he or she is going to listen to that multinational company which has paid them money to win their. None of us raised a voice. Only some of us were shouting and shouting, but it was such a thin layer of voice, and the rest of India was sleeping. It is now opted to bring in many East India companies with this particular law that was passed. And so We have opted through silence, we have given consent to become another colonial state. But only the fragile appearance of a vote, but without any real power. The most important thing is that we must talk, that we must talk. And we must talk gently maybe, but we can talk logically and persistently. But you cannot still the voices of 1.20 billion people if they talk sense. It has to somewhere make a difference. And if it doesn't make a difference, then the universe doesn't exist, because after all, everything has to exist on some logic. Where is that logic? That logic has to come into play. And I think I'm not a believer, I'm an agnostic at best, and I cannot believe in anything, but I believe in rationality. And I do think that rationality and logic must deliver someday. Otherwise, without that, where are we?
Thank you, ma'am.
I think that was a very powerful statement, ma'am. And since I am mandated to also keep the time, so I think we have coming to the end of our allotted time. I would like to thank all of you for having participated in this very interesting evening today. Thank you so much, ma'am. Ms. Aruna Roy, I have read a lot about you. I've read a lot you've written, but this is the first time I have seen, heard you face to face, and it's online. I hope sometimes we meet. And the bonus of the evening, of course, was Professor Hargopal. Thank you so much, sir, for your comments on this issue and for giving us a very good conversation. Thank you all. I'll close this session now.
इस आशा के साथ कि हम एक दिन रूबरू मिलेंगे.
Yes.
Sure.
इससे और मजा ही आएगा. आशा करते हैं एक दिन मिलेंगे हम लोग.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
बहुत शुक्रिया असगर साहब इस पूरे 1.5 घंटे तक हमारे साथ जुड़ने के लिए, और जिस तरह से आपने हमारी हिम्मत को बढ़ाई है, क्योंकि अरुणा मैम के साथ मॉडरेट करना हमारे लिए एक बड़ी चैलेंजिंग काम थी. अभी तक तो हमने सिर्फ सुना है प्रोफेसर हरगोपाल और मिस अरुणा को. डेफिनेटली डेमोक्रेसी डायलॉग और तमाम लोग जो यहाँ जुड़े हुए हैं उनको बिल्कुल उम्मीद होगी कि कभी आप हैदराबाद तशरीफ लाएं, और हमारे लिए बहुत खुशगवार मौका होगा कि आप यहाँ आए और हम किसी भी फिजिकल ऐसे इवेंट को किसी हॉल में, किसी इंस्टीट्यूशनल सेंटर में बड़े पैमाने पे करें. मुझे उम्मीद है और आप तमाम को मालूम होगा हैदराबाद एक ऐसा शहर है जहाँ पर वी हैव अ डाइवर्स डायलॉग ongoing process, and this is a city which has multicultural viewpoints, space. And as you know, Pulla Garu was writing that, you know, the inputs given by many of you are going to be learning to some of us. Thank you, Professor Ranu Jain, for being here. It is always a strength for any democratic dialogue when you are also there. And I thank everyone here who are here, who have been with us. With us means who have been working in strengthening democratic process and democracy dialogues across the country. On behalf of this forum, I also thank Masood, my friend, who is founder member of Democracy Dialogue, who could find ways to bring the guest of the evening on this forum. Thank you, Masood, for having worked for this, and thank you everyone. It was really nice having all of you here.
तो वापस मिलेंगे इंशाअल्लाह.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Inshallah.